Director of Engagement and Partnerships here at the Council on Criminal Justice. And I'm joined today by my colleague, the Mark Levin, who I also co-lead the Centering Justice Initiative here at the Council. We're honored to have you here with us today for today's conversation. We're also very honored to have our speakers, who you will hear from shortly. Before we begin, and before I pass it over to Mark to begin framing the issue that we're here to discuss today, I just want to remind folks of some quick housekeeping stuff. One is that we will have a question and answer session towards the end of the hour. So please feel free to drop your questions in the chat throughout the discussion, and we will try to get to as many questions as possible before we end today at 1 p.m. Eastern. Also, a recording and a summary of today's event will be made available on CCJ's website afterward, and you will see a number of social media postings about that. So the topic of today's discussion is centered on juveniles in the justice system, primarily focusing on youth and incarceration. A 2024 report from the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention at the DOJ shows that from 2005 to 2021, the number of delinquency cases declined 73%, with decreases in all 4 offense categories. And those categories are violent, property, drug, and other. Mark, I'm going to stop there so you can weigh in on the issue too.
Sure. Well, we have seen this dramatic reduction in both youth incarceration and crime over the last 2 decades, and it's been driven by falling youth arrest rates, as well as an increased use of diversion and alternatives to out-of-home placements. Think about programs like juvenile probation, but also juvenile drug courts, functional family therapy, and diversion entirely from the system, especially for kids such as status offenders, to be handled either in the child welfare system or just through informal dispositions, really with an emphasis on leveraging the family and school system to have positive interventions, especially for the youngest kids with the most minor offenses. But we've had this enormous decrease in volume, but we still have major challenges facing the field. Our recent report on juvenile crime trends shows while violent crimes by juveniles have fallen in recent years, there's been a 65% increase in juvenile homicides. And we've certainly heard a lot about that recently. We also found that when we break down the different age groups, there's been an increase in offending by the youngest juveniles of 10 to 14, while older juveniles 15 to 17 saw a decrease in offending from 2016 to 2022. And so it is a more nuanced picture than perhaps the most aggregate data suggests. Of course, another concern is following the pandemic, we know there were at least 1 million kids who never returned to school, and we're still seeing a gap in terms of learning where we would like to be on that. And of course, we still see significant racial disparities, and indeed, although Black children, for example, are 6 times more likely to be incarcerated than white children, and Native American 4 times as more likely. And so it's important to delve into the data and look at explanations of why that might be occurring. Khalil, I'll send it back to you.
Yes, thank you, Mark. To Mark's point, some states have responded to the youth crime concerns with efforts to roll back juvenile justice reforms, and that's part of the reason that we're here to talk about this topic today. In 2024, states including Connecticut, Kansas, Kentucky, Louisiana, Maryland, and Massachusetts, as well as North Carolina and Tennessee, all introduced legislation that either expanded automatic transfer of youth to adult court or repealed previous juvenile justice reforms. At the federal level, House Resolution 5140 recently passed and pending a vote in the Senate. The resolution would lower the age for which youth offenders in the District of Columbia can be tried as an adult for certain criminal offenses, changing the threshold from 14 years of age changing the threshold to 14 years of age from the age of 18. So we obviously have a lot to get into today. What we just mentioned in terms of reports and statistics and data is just literally skimming the surface. And to kick us off, we've invited Tom Woods from the Annie E. Casey Foundation to offer some additional points to help ground the conversation before we turn to our panelists, and to focus on data. The Casey Foundation's mission is to build better futures for disadvantaged children and their families in the United States by fostering policies, reforming human services, and strengthening communities to meet their specific needs. Tom is a senior associate and is also a member of Casey's Juvenile Justice Strategies Group with responsibility for data analysis, data management, capacity building, and strategic planning. Tom, I'll turn it over to you, and thank you again for joining us.
Well, thank you very much. I personally appreciate being here, and I also want to thank CCJ for keeping the juvenile part of the criminal justice system in focus through conversations like this and through your really exemplary report that came out last year. I'm within the Casey Foundation, within my unit. I'm sort of the in-house data nerd, I guess. So I'm glad we're starting with a quick look at the data and sort of past and recent trends. But if I'm honest, I know, and we all know, that trends and data don't tell you everything that's important when the subject is youth crime. If you live in a community that suffered from high rates of crime for generations, had to learn to live with heavy police presence on your streets every day, it's not much comfort for someone like me to say that things used to be 50% worse. If you or someone you love has been a victim, if a young person you care about is engaging in crime, if you were incarcerated as a child yourself and are still trying to heal and rejoin society, for you, youth crime isn't something that can be described by abstract numbers on a chart. But when we think about how government and society should respond, trends do matter. They ground us in facts and give us some context to help make sense of where we stand right now. So let's quickly take a look. Next slide, please.
Give me 1 second, Tom. Sorry, we're trying to get your slides up. Just had an issue.
Okay, there we go. Yeah, and of course, there's no perfect measure of youth crime. We have a lot of sources to draw on, whether reported crimes, arrests, court referrals, detention admissions, self-reported behaviors. But over the past 30 years, all of those different data sources have told a consistent story, as Mark sort of outlined. From the 1990s through 2019, that story was really pretty simple. Law breaking by young people, including serious and violent crimes, fell sharply. This chart shows the trends in just 3 indicators: juvenile arrests, delinquency cases disposed by juvenile courts, and sort of a good proxy for the number of young people who are detained for delinquency. The scale of these numbers is very different. So just for simplicity and to kind of focus on how the numbers have changed, I indexed everything to 2019. So just at a glance, you can see that that peak in the mid-90s and the steady drop off in both arrests and juvenile court cases through 2019, very striking. Over those same years, juvenile justice systems also became less reliant on incarceration, more focused on diversion and rehabilitation. Not exactly at the same pace. You can notice it took several years of falling arrests before detention admissions began to decline. But we didn't see a contrast or a trade-off between less crime and less incarceration. The declines in both went hand in hand. So let's go to the next slide. And now we're zooming in a little bit on just the last 10 years and kind of focusing on the period that was covered by that CCJ report that came out last year that was looking at data up through 2022. So COVID landed on the juvenile justice system the same way that it landed on every other part of our society, and it was a jolt. Initially, all of the numbers that we're talking about fell sharply: arrests, delinquency cases, detention admissions. But at the same time, the prevalence of some very serious crimes, especially those involving guns and car thefts, went up. And by 2022 and 2023, all the numbers we're talking about were rising again. So a lot of people wondered, and it was reasonable to wonder, was the long decline over? Were we looking at, for the first time in over 30 years, the start of a new upswing in youth crime? So let's go to the next slide. Now that we have some more recent data beginning to come in, the answer to that appears to be emerging is no. And why do I say that? First, we now have data on juvenile arrests for 2024, and it looks like they did decline from the 2023 level. Second, since the start of the pandemic in 2020, the Casey Foundation has been running a monthly survey of youth detention across a large swath of the country. And over the past 5+ years, trends in that survey have aligned very closely with other national indicators when those eventually become available. And in our monthly survey sites, youth detention admissions peaked in mid-2023 and have been declining generally since then. So together with that new data on juvenile arrests, we feel like we could say with some confidence that the pandemic and its aftermath probably marked an interruption in the long-term trends and not a reversal of them. Now, that is not to say that the level of youth crime today is acceptable or low. Obviously, it isn't. It can go lower. By international standards, it's still pretty high. We should be deeply concerned about lowering it, and we should work diligently to achieve that. But we can and should go about that with confidence that youth crime is an addressable problem. We've learned a lot about what works and what doesn't, and we don't have to throw out that playbook. Rather, we need to recommit ourselves to doing more of what works and less of what doesn't. On the next slide, before we wrap up a discussion about trends, about how things have changed, I think it's important to acknowledge some things that haven't changed over the years, despite those big swings in youth crime indicators. One, as Mark mentioned earlier, the salience of race and ethnicity continue to be undeniably and unacceptably high. Communities of color, especially Black families, still bear the heaviest burden of crime and system involvement. Kids of color, especially Black males, are still more likely to face the juvenile justice system's harshest sanctions. And those disparities have, if anything, worsened in recent years. And I don't raise this just as a matter of fairness. If we want more effective policies and a better youth justice system, this data about disparities is telling us which communities we need to listen to and lift up and work alongside. We don't have to choose between being more equitable and being more effective. Once again, the two go hand in hand. Second, it remains a mistake to conflate youth crime and violent crime. Violent offenses are no doubt serious and they are tragic, and the extra jolt of concern that we feel when they're committed by a young person is a justified human impulse. But the facts are that most youth crime is nonviolent, and most violent crime isn't committed by youth. So why is it a problem to conflate the two? Again, because it's not just because it's unfair to blame young people for a society-wide spike in violence, but it's also counterproductive. When we focus only on the narrow intersection between youth crime and violent crime, we're failing to address the bulk of either problem. So where does that leave us? I feel like there are two big takeaways from all of this. First, the lessons of the past 2 decades for juvenile justice system leaders still hold. More diversion and rehabilitation, providing accountability in tandem with resources and opportunities, connecting young people with caring adults, restoring ties to family and community rather than severing them. These, over the 2 decades of reform, we've learned that strategies that are built on these pillars are more effective, and that is still true. These approaches work. Second, the evidence tells us that less youth incarceration is still compatible with less youth crime. Incarceration isn't a complement to the strategies that work. It's a distraction from them at best and can actively undermine them at worst. When we talk with people in the communities where we work all over the country about the best things that they have going when it comes to helping young people and reducing youth crime, nobody points at their detention center. Now, maybe that's not data, but it's a useful insight that I think we should bear in mind as we dig deeper into the next part of the discussion. So thanks for your time.
Thanks so much, Tom. Mark, over to you for the first question.
Sure. Well, first of all, I want to thank Tom for his remarks and also just say how glad I am to have Senator Missy Irvin from Arkansas with us. She helped spearhead significant changes in the Arkansas juvenile system in their most recent legislative session, including preventing prosecution of kids under 10, requiring judges to consider childhood trauma at time of sentencing, and also protecting child trafficking survivors from prosecution, which is also something Texas just did and signed by governor. I think it all illustrates there's tremendous interest across the spectrum in how do we balance properly accountability, public safety, and rehabilitation. And so I'd like to throw it open to the whole panel to respond to Tom's remarks and also say, do you think have we gone too far one way or the other, or do you think we're still on the right track generally in achieving that balance?
Mm-hmm. And I'm sorry, Mark, before panelists start responding to the question, I neglected to introduce our esteemed panelists. So let me just do that quick. And for the sake of time, I won't read through their bios. I'll just say their names and the organizations that they're representing. We will put links to the to each speaker in the chat. So for the attendees, please pay attention to that. And then to answer a question, yes, we will make sure that folks can get a hold of Tom's slides because I know that some folks weren't able to see that. So just to answer that question that's being prompted in the Q&A. So first we have our Hernan Carvente Martinez. He is the Executive Director of Alianza for Opportunity. Senator Missy Thomas Irvin, as Mark had already alluded to, is an Arkansas Senate District 24 representative. And of course, we have Rafael A. Mangual, who is the Nick O'Neill Fellow at the Manhattan Institute. Thank you to each of you again for joining us and for taking the time today to share your thoughts and your perspective on this issue. So back over to Mark's prompt for whoever wants to open it up.
I'm happy to lead us off. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon if you're in the East Coast, and good morning to everyone else. To answer the question bluntly, I think that the renewed focus on juvenile justice right now is a mirror, and it's a mirror that is being held up because of our unfinished business as a country. Each time headlines spike, we reach for explanations that oftentimes fit a political frame, but safety isn't left or right. It's local and it's lived. And as someone incarcerated as a teenager for attempted murder, I know how violence can feel like the only language you have when your real language, grief, fear, trauma has all been ignored at home, in school, and by the very systems that are supposed to help you. So the data can tell part of the story, as Tom, alluded to, but not the whole. And I think national trends don't reveal the neighborhood level realities young people are navigating, nor the gaps in mental health care, stable housing, credible messengers, and dignified work that actually shapes the choices that young people make. And while some indicators have improved, as the data has also alluded to, other serious harms, like the rise in juvenile homicides identified by CCJ, spark really understandable alarm. I get it, right? If you cause harm, people around that community tend to be nervous, tend to be in shock, and want some type of accountability for the action that was caused. But the question here is how we respond. We can recycle retribution and widen disparities, or we can double down on approaches that combine accountability, as Tom alluded to, that also center healing, repair, and real pathways to belonging so that young people can choose something better than harm. And I think that that's where we're seeing this renewed focus, right? Because of what we're seeing on headlines, but also what's being ignored at the community level at present.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's an excellent point, Hernan, when you talk about community level impact, sometimes don't always align with what we're seeing with the data, or at least the community level perception as well. So Senator Irvin and or Raphael, do you want to respond to that question? Why do you think we're seeing a renewed focus on juvenile justice?
I'll defer to the senator. Go ahead.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. Very excited to be on this call. This has been such a long passion of mine, juvenile justice, and a lot of work. I really want to shout out and thank so many of people that have helped along the pathway of us passing significant reform. I'm so proud of the state of Arkansas. I'm so proud of my Republican Women Legislative Caucus that took this on their back and said, we're doing this. And Governor Hutchinson, Governor Sanders. And I will say, I think it's so important. I think you're seeing because of the headlines, because of the tragedies, and we can analyze that to death. People are they're not well. They're not well emotionally, they're not well physically, they're not well spiritually. So I could go down that path. I think for me, I want to just offer, we created with the Reclaim Arkansas Act back in 2019. It took a long time to pass this. Annie Casey Foundation was with me every step of the way. But we established under the Supreme Court Chief Justice at the time, Judge Hanna, established a commission of children and youth and families. And we, together with juvenile judges, and then that was taken over by Justice Rhonda Wood, who was a juvenile judge herself. So we work really closely with the juvenile judges. And we have very good, legitimate, we've done amazing work with zero funding, basically. We've received grants and things like that with the commission, but there's no steady. It's just very interested stakeholders. DYS is at the table, DCFS is at the table, lawmakers are at the table, our judges are at the table, our Supreme Court justices are at the table, your advocates are all at the table. And we had a retreat this past summer that was just unbelievable. And I'm so excited because, you know, yeah, we did great stuff and we have done great stuff including this past session, but there's just so much more to do. And so we just had a great retreat. So I think the answer is making sure that you have legitimate structure in place that continues the effort. It can't just be laws that you pass. I think it's got to be a continued effort, because what you're going to see is just what Mr. Carvente Martinez, I hope I got that correct. What he said is completely right. People will overreact sometimes in the wrong way to headlines or to what's happening right now if you don't have a steady, consistent presence when it comes to reforms and laws. And we can't overreact to situations. We've got to make sure we're thoughtful and analytical about it.
Such an important point, Senator, that yes, reforms of any type, they have to not only be passed, they have to be implemented, and then they have to be studied and reviewed. So yes, the long term in terms of any type of reform, but particularly as it relates to criminal justice reform, all too often is not for the faint of heart, as they say.
No,
So
we've had, and I'll just say we've had amazing bipartisan support. I mean, 100% support
yeah.
in our reforms.
Yes, bipartisan support in all of this, but definitely as relates to CJ reform is absolutely needed. So Rafi, I'm going to turn to you now with the same question, if I may. Why do you think we're seeing a renewed focus on juvenile justice?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the reason has to do with a change in what we're seeing in the data, and we are seeing a change in the data. And, you know, I think it's perfectly legitimate to be skeptical of any push for policy that is sort of driven by headlines, right? I don't think making policy based on headlines is a good thing. But that's also, I think, a question we could have asked more fervently back when a lot of the juvenile justice reforms were first being pushed, which was in many ways a response to headlines, you know, on the other side of this equation. But when you look at, you know, I'll use my home city of New York as an example. I mean, in 2017, we passed a pretty significant Raise the Age initiative, which raised the age of criminal responsibility and led to a lot of leniency for juvenile offenders age 16 and 17. There was kind of a staggered effectiveness. So in 2018, the first year it went into effect, it only affected 16-year-old offenders. And then 2019 affected 17-year-old offenders. And what was cool about that staggered approach was that it gave us an opportunity to study what the effects of that policy have been. And in New York City, I know that a lot of people are asking questions about whether or not that particular change was wise. And one of the reasons we're asking those questions is that, as our NYPD Commissioner, Jessica Tisch, noted earlier this year, between 2018, the year that Raise the Age went into effect here, and 2024, the number of juvenile shooters in New York City spiked by nearly 200%. The number of juvenile shooting victims jumped by more than 80%. You know, there are a lot of folks who I think, you know, view, I'll say, you know, my side of this issue as those on my side of this issue as being sort of hyper focused on the problem of offending. And I do think that being, you know, worried about offending patterns is important. But I think another question we ought to be asking is, you know, whether the juveniles that have benefited from these reforms are themselves better off. And when you see such a large spike in victimization, I think that's a legitimate question to ask. I mean, if you look at just data from New York City, and I have some here at my fingertips, 83% of felony arrests are ending up in family court in the wake of Raise the Age, which means that those cases almost never result in any kind of significant criminal responsibility. And I think one of the questions that I, you know, wanted people to just start thinking about on their own is, you know, what is the case for treating juvenile offenders differently from any other class of criminal offenders of a different age, right? I mean, when you think about what the criminal justice system exists to do, right? To me, of the four penological ends served by criminal punishment, the two that mean the most, the two that matter, I think, more than anything else, is incapacitation, more than deterrence, but deterrence would be a very distant second. Outside of that, I don't think that the criminal justice system is poised to do very well on measures like rehabilitation, and nor do I think retribution should really be driving policy decisions. But incapacitation is important for a number of reasons, because to the extent that you can take a criminal offender who is at a point in his or her life in which he or she is engaged in a high rate of offending and engaged in extremely risky behavior, you have a responsibility as a society to protect society from those individuals who are in the midst of a criminal offending pattern. But also, I think we have an obligation to protect those offenders from the world that they have ensconced themselves in. And, one of the things that I don't think gets enough appreciation is the fact that a lot of the people who are winding up back on the street as a result of these reforms are targets themselves. Here in New York City, our community is reeling from the death of a 13-year-old boy who was shot and killed outside of a Dunkin' Donuts in the middle of a gang fight just a couple weeks ago. The shooter, who is still at large, is alleged to be a 16-year-old gang member. These are individuals who probably have prior contact with the criminal justice system through arrests that have been sealed. Are they better off, having been released after those interactions? I mean, I think these are all questions that a lot of people are starting to ask when you see the spikes in shooting involvement for teenage offenders. And so I think that's really at the core of why a lot of these questions are getting asked. And I think that that's a healthy debate to have.
Yeah, can I just follow up with a quick question? To what degree, Raphael, do you think the problem is judges there in New York, in the sense that they do have the authority to certify youth as adults for serious felonies, which is actually what we have in Texas as well. And of course, if they're just going to go on probation, they actually get arguably more supervision, smaller caseloads in the juvenile system. So there's the argument. I've heard some criminal defense lawyers prefer adult probation because they know their 16-year-old client isn't going to get watched much. But is part of the issue, you think, the judges?
I'm sure that's part of the issue, but in New York, meeting the standard for adult court is actually a lot more difficult than it looks on paper. The requirements are pretty stringent. So there are three basic requirements that need to be met. One is that the defendant has to have caused significant physical injury to a person other than another participant in the offense, right? So if the felony murder rule wouldn't count there. Two, the defendant has to either have displayed a firearm, shotgun, rifle, or deadly weapon, or engaged in a serious sex offense. Now, those things are a lot harder to prove in practice than they seem on paper. For example, if you have a group of gang members, say, 7 offenders who jump an opposing gang member, you have to prove in court which individual caused which injury. And when you have a gang assault, that actually becomes a much harder question for judges to answer. And then once cases get removed to family court, I mean, family court judges are often blinded to the full criminal histories of the people before them. So I think that judges are at somewhat of a disadvantage just based on how the law itself has been drafted, which is one of the things that, I think need to be looked at here in New York.
Speaking of judges, and this is maybe a good segue into some of the questions directly to each speaker. So let's start with you, Hernan, and then I want to circle back at the end with another quick round of some rapid fire questions. So Hernan, we obviously heard the presentation, we heard the data, we've seen the statistics. What do you think is behind the decline in youth crime and incarceration? Do you feel that it is some of those changes are because of changes that have happened in society, or do you think some of it has been changes that have happened in policy? And sub-question to that is, do you think the introduction and obviously the proliferation of smartphones and social media by extension is part of the story on what we're seeing.
Yeah, thank you, Khalil. And thank you, Rafael, for your perspective. As someone who lived through the raise the age era in New York City, because that's where I was incarcerated, I always think back at the amount of conversations that I was a part of where the conversation in the room was always about the nonviolent young person going through the system and always feeling like I was thrown under the bus when it came to the violent felony conversation. And so I think, it's really important, Khalil, that we acknowledge that both matter, right? The society impact and the policy impact. But intentional policy is the lever that we can control. Society has shifted different patterns for youth activity, technology reshaping social life, more awareness of mental health. But I think the steep reshaping of social life, is also rooted in the fact that the declines in the system contact came from people making hard choices, right? Expanding diversion, building community alternatives, closing youth prisons, so that dollars could flow to kids back at home. There was a movement, right, to do all of that work. Families, young people, practitioners saying that safety is accountability plus opportunity, right? So it's not just about shifting, a policy like raise the age. You can think about raise the age as a standalone policy, but there were other trickles that happened after that within the implementation, right? And some of that actually led to other debates in, New York City Hall about where resources should be allocated to actually carry out some of the back end elements of raise the age. And some of those pieces are still yet to be funded or continue to be underfunded in ways that are very much impacting the spikes that Rafael is talking about in the community, right? So we can talk about, all of that in detail, but as someone who's also lived inside the system, I'm clear that none of this progress excuses harm, right? It does, however, insist on responses that actually reduce harm. And when we invest in what works, credible messengers, family-centered supports, restorative practice, job pathways, we don't just lower incarceration, right? We build the conditions where accountability is very much developmental and not destructive, both for the person who committed the harm, someone like myself, and also for the people who have been harmed in our community. And so, we must hold on to that nuance as we face the troubling indicators, like the increases in juvenile homicides, without abandoning the broader gains. To the question of social media, I do believe that yes, it has impacted and played a role, both as an accelerant of a lot of this and also as a lifeline for many things. Conflicts that once stayed on the block now travel at the speed of a post. Shame and performance can escalate decisions. If people are getting told, your system sucks, over and over in media, people are responding to that, right? In real time, trying to avoid, political conflict or oftentimes their positions being targeted in some way. And digital records can also lead to harsher system responses, right? So the fact that we have video, the fact that people are recording in real time does create the opportunity for Rafael, to what he mentioned of who did the harm, but in reality, even those point in time snapshots not fully capture the full breadth of a situation and how it got to that point. So those same tools that connect youth to movements and mentors and meaning are also the tools that are leading to some of this crime and some of the proliferation of some of these narratives. But the question isn't if tech is good or bad. It's whether adults have built the guidance, norms, and safe practices that help youth use those tools without being consumed by them, which we know right now is a thing with TikTok, Instagram. Young people are receiving their news, their information, and other resources that are oftentimes not coming from people who have a license to speak on some of these, but come from lived experience, but have no place to hold that. So when we fail to provide that scaffolding, we shouldn't be surprised when young people turn to the loudest, fastest feedback available, and we shouldn't mistake punishment for a plan, a plan for how to address all of these things.
Yeah. No, those are excellent points, Hernan. Raphael, I want to turn to you with the next question. But before I do, just a quick reminder to everyone that we will be taking questions. We're looking to do that about 10 before the hour. So we're going to power through some of our questions here and get to the Q&As, get to the questions that are put in the Q&A chat. So thank you for those who have already submitted. Please continue submitting. So Raphael, even though we've seen a overall drop in youth incarceration, there is still, as you know, gap between who gets arrested and sentenced. And that gap has actually gotten bigger. So recent FBI data shows that Black youth are being arrested for more serious offenses compared to white youth. And those differences show up in incarceration rates as well, obviously. How can we tackle this growing disparities? What new ideas or solutions should we be thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I'm going to choose not to resist my instinct to resist the premise of the question, which is that we should be trying to address the disparity rather than the problem of the violence that's actually leading to the disparity. Again, I'll just use data from my home city of New York. In our city, for every single year that we've been keeping data since 2008, at least 95% of our shooting victims are either Black or Latino. Right? This city is not 95% Black or Latino. It never has been. It's never been close. That is one of the most profound and most persistent racial disparities that you're going to see in the criminal justice data sphere. And it hasn't changed very much. When we ask through reforms our criminal justice system to increasingly ignore the least serious offenses and increasingly focus on the most serious offenses, when you have disparities in victimization and perpetration that are that stark, those disparities are going to show up in those enforcement patterns, right? Who gets arrested is largely driven by where police are spending their time. And where police are spending their time is driven by where the most serious crime is concentrated. Now, we can ask the question of whether or not we want police to be evenly distributed throughout a city like New York. I would say that that would be one of the least anti-racist approaches to public safety provision, right? To give a community like Park Slope, which has a homicide rate of essentially zero, the same amount of police attention and resources that we give to a community like the South Bronx, a neighborhood like Soundview, I think would be a profound disservice to the latter community, which absolutely needs more of those resources. So if we accept that police should be disproportionately deployed to where crime is disproportionately concentrated, and we accept that police and the criminal justice system should focus more on reserving sanctions like incarceration for the most serious crimes where you have the starkest racial disparities in both victimization and perpetration, then I don't think it's particularly wise to begin an analysis with the disparity in enforcement and say that we want to shrink this. The disparity that I want to shrink more than anything else is disparity in shooting victimization rates. I think it's insane that we live in a country in which young Black men are 10 times more likely to be shot and killed than young white men. I want to change that disparity. So yeah, I mean, I guess all that to say is that I'm not particularly concerned with the disparity in enforcement if there is ample evidence that that disparity in enforcement is driven by a disparity in criminal behavior that we should be concerned about. And when you think about, the potential effects of operating the criminal justice system in the way that we operate it and the potential effects of sanctions like incarceration, we tend to focus on the harms in a lot of these conversations, right? The harms associated with incarceration, the criminogenic effect of incarceration, the traumatic effect of incarceration. But there is also a crime-reducing effect of incarceration, one that is well documented. When you incapacitate a violent and high-rate prolific offender, you are shielding the community that offender would otherwise spend his time in from the crimes that would otherwise be committed, that are not committed in that offender's absence. Those benefits are not evenly distributed either. And that has to be part of our analysis. I mean, part of my critique of the sort of hyper focus on racial disparities has been that it really only looks at one side of the ledger, right? When the criminal justice system operates, it enforces, but there are outgrowths from that enforcement in the form of crime declines, and those crime declines are benefiting different communities differently. So if you look at the homicide decline from 1990 to 2014, where in this country where the homicide rate was reduced by about 50%, and you look at the effect on life expectancy, that decline added a full year of life expectancy to the average Black man's life in this country. It only added 0.14 years of life expectancy to the average white man's life. That is a profound racial disparity in the distribution of benefits associated with a crime decline that I think was largely a byproduct of an increase in police enforcement an increase in incarceration, and investments in our criminal justice system. Now, those aren't the only things that drove that crime decline, but I do think that they had a sort of disproportionate effect on that overall crime trend. So all that to say is, I think we should zoom out and reframe that question, and start with the disparities in victimization that ultimately everything else is a byproduct of.
Thank you, Raphael. I think you raised an excellent point that data is important data is at the crux of this, and looking at all data associated with this issue is important. Mark, I'm going to turn it over to you for a question to Senator Ervin.
Yeah, and I think it really is a good follow-up because looking at the school system and early intervention, back when Texas did justice reinvestment in 2007, Nurse Family Partnership was part of it. And my good friend, conservative Republican House Corrections Committee Chairman at the time, Jerry Madden, said, yeah, this isn't going to reduce incarceration in the next few years, but 15 years from now, absolutely. And so where you see the greatest public support is early on what we can do in terms of the education system, a child's upbringing, so they never take that path towards committing the kind of offenses Raphael was talking about. So I wanted to ask you, Senator Ervin, what do you see as what schools can do? I mean, obviously there's things from school resource officers to after school programs. What do you see as the most promising approaches to keeping kids from even getting into the juvenile justice system?
Couple different things. Number one, we passed legislation that is from bell to bell, no cell. You're talking about social media. I'm a mom of 4, and my kids didn't get cell phones until they graduated from high school, if that tells you anything about me. We were out working on the farm. We have cows, we have horses, work. I mean, get to work. And they were not spoiled. They drove a big old farm truck to school. But we passed that legislation. I'm a big proponent of that. Put the phones down, put the phones away. It accelerates. Completely agree with those comments. And I think we as adults right now really have got to talk about this and show some leadership to try to create diversions and create more programs of for kids to participate in that's away from social media. It's destroying their relationships with one. I could go down that list, but the schools doing that and passing legislation this session was a big deal, and for schools. Secondly, school resource officers, making sure that they know their role there. Not that they're not overtly law enforcement, but that they have training that's very specific to handling and de-escalating situations that don't lead to just, hey, I'm just going to arrest you and haul you off. I'm so opposed to that. And I know we've had some issues with that. I try to attend our school safety conference every year. I've done a lot of legislation on school safety, which increase school resource officers, but it's really there for school safety issues, not to try to encourage more incarceration or getting these people in trouble. The third thing too that's really, really important is we need to have technology apply to these situations where things are more automated and get these decisions out of just a superintendent's hands or a dean of students' hands when it comes to delinquency issues or absentee issues. I had a situation where she was a senior in high school. It just made me crazy. Senior in high school, she did not turn her doctor's note in the day that she was supposed to, but one day late. Ended her up in juvenile court. That was absolutely unnecessary. It was ridiculous. Then she turned 18 in the middle of the adjudication. So they just didn't even look at that. The prosecuting attorneys dropped their ball. They should have never gotten to the court system ever. And it really was just a superintendent that was mad because she attended a Dallas Cowboy game it was so stupid. But she was a great student graduating. She had to do community service after she graduated from high school. I mean, come on, just stupid, so stupid. But if you have a dashboard, and a friend of mine has created a dashboard solution he's in Mountain Home, Arkansas. He worked for Walmart in Sam Walton, a brilliant, brilliant guy. But we know students that are in academic distress. Easy. they're getting an A, B, C, or D. If they're in C or D or an F, we know that they need academic help. You can do the same thing with the information already available on children, on kids, and on youth by creating a dashboard that says, hey, this person may be in crisis. This man created the system as a result of a young woman who committed suicide. And his friend was the superintendent and said, when we all kind of got together as in a school administration and we reviewed what happened with this young lady, there were tons of red flags, but none of us were communicating. And so it was like, it was in this file cabinet and this file cabinet and this file cabinet. She was asking to switch classes. She was not showing up in one class period. There was social media. They knew, but they had all the pieces, but they weren't put together. Technology can help us do that, creating a dashboard. And we have actually employed that in certain schools in the state of Arkansas, where they do have more gang related activities in the community, where you actually then could see, hey, this is a more at-risk youth. We need to make sure that we're more intentional about that child and about that student and utilize the information that we have. We need to be clearly communicating to the schools, need to communicate to the juvenile justice system and to law enforcement. Really, that's hard to do, I get, but we should be able to do that. That way, everybody can be on the same page. We know why things are happening at school because of what's happening at home. There's information that's being gathered. It's just not collected into a single dashboard or an area where the grown-ups in the room have the ability to go, oh, this is why this is happening. Oh, okay, we're in a bad path here. We need to create some intervention early on. The information exists. It's just siloed. And that's the problem. And so, doctors have information. My husband's a family practice doctor, so he called me. He was like, "Can you believe that they did this to Princess? You've got to call that judge." Of course, I was on the phone, with the Supreme Court when that happened. But I mean, it's just unbelievable how that can occur. So the schools play a massive role in this, and there's a million different ways that we can really be more intentional and about the utilization, because that's where they're spending the majority of their time. So we're missing out on that opportunity. I could talk forever about that.
Thank you, Senator, so much. Mark, your next question. I think this is gonna probably be the last question because we do want to get to the Q&A. There are a ton of questions coming in. So, and then of course we want to save time for everyone's final remarks. So Mark, over to you.
Oh, I think you're muted, Mark.
Mark?
Yeah, you're muted, Mark. Sorry.
Wanted to ask everyone's thoughts on juvenile curfews. DC and Cincinnati recently implemented them. Texas, on the other hand, in a previous legislative session, 2023, banned juvenile curfews, largely a conservative-led effort out of concern about the rights of parents, especially homeschool parents. So it's kind of one of those issues that doesn't always fall on ideological lines. And the research is a little bit unclear as to what the benefits are. But anyway, Raphael, did you want to weigh in on that first?
Yeah. I mean, I guess my initial disposition is to be somewhat skeptical of the effectiveness of curfews, particularly on the subpopulation of juvenile offenders that I'm most concerned about, which are, potential shooters. If you are someone who is carrying a gun and willing to use it, my guess is that you're not going to be particularly deterred by the risk of violating a curfew if you're willing to risk the serious consequences associated with, an aggravated felony or, some kind of violent felony charge. So yeah, I don't think that they're particularly effective. I think by and large, parents are probably playing the most significant role in, actually seeing to it that curfews are respected by their own children. And for those children, I think you're probably looking at significantly lower risk anyway, right? If their parents are that involved. So yeah, that's my kind of initial take.
Hernan, Senator, anything to weigh in?
Yeah, I'll just say I tend to agree. I don't I think it's the kids that are at risk, they may not have the structure at home to be able to provide a curfew. I mean, nothing good ever happens after midnight. It's what I've always was raised to believe. So it's messaging, like let's say that, and this is why we say this, or, but putting your efforts and your focus into like really be more intentional about the messages that we're giving to youth and teaching them, understanding they may not have the support structure at home or a family structure. Many people go to gangs because they don't have a family structure, and the gang provides them a family structure, sadly. But they're not getting the right messaging clearly from that. But we just need to, I think, do that. And then if you're tired at the end of the day, you don't want to be out after midnight. So focus on putting activity, getting these kids involved. Focus on, I'm a huge soccer fan, and soccer will wear you out after 10 minutes of playing soccer. Wear them out. Like that's what we did with our kids, but also it works. Like I'm a big proponent of our criminal justice system of adult incarceration. I have gone out um, on, I've gone out with our unit at the North Central Correctional Unit to clean up the Blanchard Springs caverns. I've worked alongside the inmates. And it's really fun. I mean, I've had a good time and I ate lunch with them and I worked alongside with them. And I asked them, I was like, how do you feel about this? Because I know people are mixed about this. And they're like, we love it. We want to get out. We want to work. We see like at the end of the day, we are accomplished, and it's my way of giving back. And I'm stuck here for life, and I'd rather do this. And and so I know that can be difficult, but let's focus our efforts elsewhere. They're too tired to be out
Can I,
after
can I
midnight.
can I just add one quick point on the curfew thing? I mean,
Please.
even though I don't think the curfews are would themselves have a crime reduction effect, I mean, there is a conversation to be had about keeping them in place to give law enforcement a basis for initiating interactions that could themselves down the road, prevent crime, right? So if you see someone who's clearly in violation of the curfew, that gives you an opportunity to initiate an interaction that could yield a firearm and some other kind of arrest that takes somebody out of a risky situation, or it takes a risky individual
point.
out of yeah.
Yeah. And to add on to Raphael's point, I agree with both Senator and Raphael's point. I think the problem with that is the nuance of the training that is going to have to take place for officers to actually implement that in the most effective way. So that would be my only concern to Raphael's current point. But I will say, we keep bringing up parents or families. I'm privileged as hell right now. I work from home. I have a 17-year-old. And I get to see her leave for school and come back from school, and I can enforce, whether or not she goes out later past any time, or where she goes, and me being able to drop her off and pick her up. Not every family has that privilege. Some families are working 2, 3 jobs to make ends meet. In New York City alone, for those of us who live here, we can barely afford rent if you live in this state right now. And so I think there's a nuanced conversation when we talk about the focus on schools, the focus on curfews. We keep talking about the high level policy, but at the implementation level of individual family income, individual, capacity to even be able to offer some of those things, I think that's the nuance we continue to drop off to the side. And again, we are the adults in this space, but I also want to encourage us. There are young leaders out there who have such a nuanced perspective, who know how to bring in their peers into conversation. And I think it's on us to also create room and space for adult and intergenerational interaction to achieve some of these solutions, because we're not going to get anywhere with pure adults sitting in a room. We have our own preconceived notions, we have our own philosophies, we see things different. And some of us were raised in an era where you literally would have to send a letter to communicate to one another, and some of us are now raised where you can in an instant tell someone, hey, pop up at 9 p.m., there's a party out here, and people will show up in masses. So that's the difference with the conversation of curfews. It won't apply the same to everyone, and so we gotta really bring in a nuanced conversation if we're gonna get to any solution that actually helps all of us.
And just to piggyback on Hernan's point about, family capacity to, enforce, one of the things that didn't get mentioned, although there was one allusion to family structure, is that a lot of these kids who were involved in the criminal justice system were growing up in single parent homes. And these are homes in which they are at a higher risk of what we call ACEs, right? Adverse childhood experiences. They have lower rates of supervision, higher rates of trauma exposure, higher rates of parental drug use, higher rates of domestic violence exposure. All of these things are predictors of exactly the kind of psychological dispositions and conduct disorders that we see overrepresented in juvenile offending populations, right? The DSM defines a conduct disordered youth. And a conduct disordered youth, if you look at the risk factors for the development of a conduct disorder, they are exactly the same as the ACEs that are significantly more likely to be experienced by kids living in single parent, particularly single mom households. And what you're going to see in juvenile offending populations is a significant rate of overrepresentation of kids who were born to single parents. And that has to be part of this conversation. I was a co-author on a study that looked at both counties throughout the United States as well as census tracts in Chicago. We looked at the counties and census tracts that were one standard deviation above the median share of households headed by a single parent and one standard deviation below. And what we found consistently was in the communities that were a standard deviation above, you had significantly higher rates of not just overall crime, but violent crime and homicide specifically. And so that's just, I think that, if we're going to have that capacity discussion, which we absolutely should, part of that discussion has to be the family structure issue.
Yeah, no, family is obviously something that we can spend a whole other hour discussing. We are tight on time. I do want to squeeze in potentially at least one question, but potentially two, depending on how quick we can go around. So this question is for everyone. Let's start with you, Raphael, then Senator, and then Hernan, and we'll try to fit in another question. Please try to make your responses as quick as possible. Who do you think should be having the decision or making the decision whether juvenile goes into an adult system versus the juvenile court? Is it judge, prosecutor, some other entity?
So yeah, here is one of those other places where I'm going to kind of resist the premise of the question, because I think, this dichotomy is really kind of a false one. There's no, what matters in criminal justice policy to me, again, is whether or not you are achieving the highest ends that the criminal justice system exists to serve, namely incapacitation and deterrence, and incapacitation significantly more than deterrence. I don't care whether a juvenile offender goes to an adult prison or a juvenile detention facility. I care whether or not he's on the street and in an environment in which he's more likely to get into trouble and cause trouble. This idea that it's either put a 16-year-old in an adult prison with hardened offenders or nothing at all, I think escapes the question of whether or not we should invest in the development of an alternative track, a place where you're not mixing juvenile offenders with adult offenders, but they're still incapacitated and unable to offend and taken out of a cycle that is not just bad for the people around them, but bad for themselves personally.
Thank you, Raphael. Senator?
Yeah, I mean, I can't disagree with that. I think we have to be accountable. We have to have accountability. And, I think it's important to understand these are, one thing that wasn't mentioned, but it's very, very concerning to me are video games. And I know that we could talk about that forever, but I've been to where the Navy SEALs train at Fort Chaffee here in Arkansas, and they literally use a Call of Duty type of video game for training. And we've got to understand the disconnection between I can do this online in virtual world, and there's no consequences for me. I just regenerate and I come back to life. And we cannot, there's a big disconnect between real life and real life scenario. And I have to say that I believe that's contributing to our issues. Especially the shooters and what's happening, because there is no consequence. I could go down a rabbit hole, but I'm a dancer and I was a professor of dance, and I had a young lady who was severely incapacitated because she was so addicted to video gaming and gaming that she wouldn't eat for days. It was so devastating to see the effects of what was happening. I didn't really understand it, but I made her choreograph her life and this issue. And so I believe that is something that we've got to also bring into the conversation. But as far as where they end up and being, I tend to agree. I think our conversation needs to be more driven towards what is really driving the issue here before
Mhm.
they end up at that point.
Thank you, Senator. Hernan, I'm actually to squeeze your answer in, then we're gonna close out.
Yeah, I think
No pressure.
no pressure. No, I think I just want to name the pink elephant in the room. You brought up judges, you brought up prosecutors, you brought the decision makers up. And we have, consistently ignored the reality that decision makers are not being held accountable for the choices that they oftentimes make that place a young person deeper and deeper into the system. So I don't want to excuse that, but I also want to realize that the nuance of the community level resourcing and the community level, supports also need to be there. And so when it comes to a decision, putting the whole decision on a judge, putting the whole decision on a prosecutor, I think is part of the problem here, right? Like we need to be able to create tables that allow for a more nuanced perspective on a young person. And we need to start reaching across, the defense attorney talking to the prosecutor, the judges actually, bringing in community providers. I think there needs to be more of that back and forth inclusion and not giving one individual person so much power to decide on the future of a young person going forward. And I think we're going to get there, but we need to be willing to have the hard conversations of what public safety, accountability, and responsibility mean across different philosophies and across different potentially political agendas that exist.
Speaking of hard conversations, this is obviously one that we could go another hour on. It's never enough time. Thank you to our guests, our speakers, Hernan, Rafael, Senator Irvin. Thank you to the CCJ team for making this really, really easy for myself and Mark to get up here and have these. And thank you to everyone who attended. Any questions we did not get to today, you can email them to info@councilOnCJ.org, and we will try to get to those questions. Thank you again for your time, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. God bless.